Speaking this evening about the record of the rocks. As someone told me, for a fellow who has rocks in his head, this is a very appropriate subject. I plead guilty to that. I enjoy talking about the rocks. They do provide a challenge, at least in terms of the way they're typically presented. If you watch the education channels, public TV, you look in the earth science textbooks, you'll see evidence from the rocks representing that which flatly contradicts what we read in the Bible. When we look at the rocks, we're talking about not just all rocks, but the record that we have reference to involves the sedimentary rocks. That's rocks laid down by water. And if you have studied earth science, know just a little bit about geology, you understand that there is an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents. That's rocks laid down by water. Now, in those rocks, there are billions and billions of dead things that are fossils. Now, when you have billions and billions of dead things in rocks laid down by water all over the world, I think you've got a pretty strong argument for catastrophic judgment. But of course, the evolutionist tells us this was accomplished by a slow, gradual buildup over millions of years. And as we saw last night, I think it's accomplished by a rapid year-long series of catastrophes, that it could not be slow, and the evidence for slow is not there. But the evolutionary representation of this record of the rocks looks like this. This is in all the biology textbooks, all the earth science textbooks. And we're told that as you go further down in the rocks, you find these simple animals, and as you come up near the top, they get more complex, and then the modern animals near the top, which shows an evolutionary progression. And the record of the rocks has recorded, like a tape recorder, the evolution of life through time. That's their interpretation of what we're seeing. The biggest problem with this representation is rather obvious, and that is that you can't go out and look in the rocks and find it anywhere. It exists in the textbooks, but it does not exist anywhere on the face of the earth. That is, in the complete form that you see in the textbooks. Now, if that sounds like a rather brash statement, notice the quote from Leet and Judson, one of the typical textbooks used as a geology text in our universities. Because we cannot find sedimentary rock representing all of Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so instead of digging down and finding it in any one place, you find some over here and find some over there, and you tie it together and correlate the layers, not based on what you see in any one place. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, you don't get that impression in the undergraduate earth science textbooks. That's a shame. But this is not concrete, if you please. It is a mental abstraction that is built together. Well, how do you build it? How do you know when you correlate whether this rock goes down or up. Well, if you're an evolutionist and you have rocks with simple animals, where do they go? They go on the bottom. I'm somewhat oversimplifying, but that's a general picture of what's happening. R.H. Rastell in the Encyclopedia Britannica puts it this way: it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, let me illustrate and simplify, somewhat oversimplifying, but still not misrepresenting. A person says, we have a primitive fossil here. Okay, how do you know? And then, of course, that would go on the bottom of the column. But how do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's found in an old rock. All right, that would make sense. If you've got an old rock, it'd be a primitive fossil. But now, how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And this is obviously not proving anything. But that is how this column in its complete form is built. You don't determine the kind of rock it is by the kind of rock it is, but by the critters that you find in it, the dead things in the rock, and how primitive you think they are. There are a number of other problems with it as well. For one thing, as we look at this column, we see mostly animals with backbones, or the vertebrates. Relatively speaking, they just virtually don't exist in the fossil record. It's mainly clams, and more clams, at least proportionately. It's skewed, obviously, to the more impressive, larger animals, whereas at least 95% of the entire fossil record is composed of marine invertebrates. But you virtually see none of those in the geologic column. Of the 5% that's left, 4.5% are plants and algae. And we hadn't gotten to the vertebrates yet, which are mostly what you see represented in the column. The vertebrates are about 1/100th of 1%. Not 1%, 1/100th of a percent. That's just virtually not there. Most of it's, well, why don't you then represent it with marine invertebrates? Somebody might get the impression this is a marine deposit, or maybe a flood deposit, which was the impression of the founders of the discipline of geology. They all thought that, because I think that's what it clearly indicates for reasons we'll be looking at. The father of modern stratigraphy, Nicholas Steno, is touted as a hero today in all the geology textbooks. Don Patton's Evolution of the Earth says, besides correctly interpreting fossils, the result was the formulation of the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight, and he's the one that started it, and his rules are the ones you have to memorize in order to pass stratigraphy today. Steno's axioms provide the ultimate basis of practically all interpretation of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. I had one geology professor interrupt a presentation I was making down at Lamar University. We know all about Nicholas Steno. We have to memorize his 12 axioms, and she had to rattle them off right in the middle of the presentation. Well, I'm glad that you know about him and understand Nicholas Steno. But do you know how he thought this record came to be? Well, yes, he was an evolutionist. Well, that's just not the case. His book was on display in Cambridge, where I was doing work there at Trinity College, and this is a picture of that book, and it's in the flypiece stating it's dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. This is where he was coming from. In fact, it was revealed, and it's just pretty much a revelation, last year in geology, that Steno believed in a universal flood throughout his life. This is how he explained it, and he understood it well enough to write the rules that you still have to memorize if you're going to pass stratigraphy. Now, people will say, well, this flood geology is a bunch of foolishness. It won't really explain what we see in geology. Is that so? Nicholas Steno refutes that. This was his concept, and he was a pioneer who was a genius. And if you don't understand what he understands, you can't do geology today. Building on his work, men like Whitcomb and Morris wrote the Genesis flood, compiling the evidence from geology together with what we know in Genesis, and showing that this is the best explanation for what we see in the rock record. Interestingly, John C. McCampbell agreed to write the foreword to this book. He's an evolutionist, professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana. And he says in that foreword that the facts of geology do fit this explanation, and that the authors make a very strong case for this explanation and present a serious challenge to the evolutionary interpretation. Now, he didn't say their view fits, our view doesn't, but he came pretty close, even though he's an evolutionist. It does fit. And so when people say, well, it's just no way that a flood can explain what we see in geology, well, they just don't know what they're talking about. But if you had a flood, wouldn't it just mix everything up? Not necessarily. You have floods that bury things basically where they are, transporting sometimes, but the general rule is things get buried where they live, and not everything lives at the same place. Things that live at the bottom of the ocean would be buried in different places from things that live up here in Texas. And you see gradations even in the ocean. The Cambrian, the bottom lowest layer as defined by the evolutionist, is ocean bottom. Critters that lived on the bottom of the ocean, some of them very complex, as we'll see. And the Ordovician lived a little higher. The Devonian still higher, with some amphibians. And the worldwide flood would bury organisms where they lived, and I think we see that, at least in a general way, and I underscore that, because there's going to be some mixing, but in a general way, that would be reflected. And as we see and imagine the water rising, we would see different environments being buried. Now, they're not all together in one place, and you may have 2 or 3 of these in one place, but seldom more than that. But here, putting them together, it would leave a picture like this, and then when buried, we can see that it would leave a deposit that would have some kind of an order. Here we see the kind of deposit that would segregate and separate the groups of animals, and they would be buried separately, not because they're separated by millions of years, but because they live in different places, and that's where they'd be buried. Now, you don't have this kind of an ordered sequence. This is an arranged, skewed misrepresentation of what's actually there. It's a conceptual correlation that is useless as proof of evolution because it's based on the circular logic. But you do see a general order, I think, that reflects the ecology that we can observe today. I do think this representation, however, is useful as a model, as a representation of what ought to be if evolution is true. Now, we don't assume the thing to be true, build an illustration of it and say, see, it's proved. That's the circular logic. It's not proof. But it's a good model. It's an illustration of what ought to be if evolution is true. We have an alternative model, and then we compare that with the real world, with the facts, and that's how we test. We don't just holler and see who can say it's proved loudest. We look at the evidence, and we see which fits the facts best. How do you test this model against the facts? I think Stephen Stanley does a good job of describing how that test should proceed from Johns Hopkins University. He's a very famous geologist, and he says topsy-turvy fossils would test it. We'll look at a fuller description of that before we conclude tonight, but this idea of things that are supposed to be at the bottom on top or things supposed to be on the top on bottom, topsy-turvy fossils, would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. And so if you're finding things that are supposed to be on the bottom up at the top, then you've got a problem. Well, you should have. The problem for the evolutionist is we find that kind of thing all the time. That's really not that unusual. They're called living fossils. Niles Eldredge wrote a book about that. He's the curator of the American Museum of Natural History and professor at Columbia. He says there seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare, that is, of these ancient fossils supposed to be down at the bottom that are found alive today. We've not completely solved the riddle of living fossils. That would be a topsy-turvy fossil, but there's so many and it's so common they really just don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. They really want the other kind of contradiction, as we'll see. But to give an illustration of what he's talking about with living fossils, maybe the most famous one is the coelacanth. Beautiful fossil here of a rather strange-looking fish, but one that we find rather commonly in the fossil record. Described here by Keith Thompson, who's president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, as a living fossil. He says in his book, a fish thought to be extinct for 70 million years, which is about the time the dinosaurs have been extinct. The fish was a coelacanth, an animal that thrived concurrently with the dinosaurs, but from the point where they're supposed to have gone extinct, all the way up the column, you find no coelacanths and virtually no dinosaurs. They look quite like the what? The modern forms. Yes, we have found them. Now, he says we have no fossil coelacanths younger than the late Cretaceous. That's where the dinosaurs are supposed to have gone extinct. And so we've got plenty of them up to that point. From that point forward, nothing. But so far, we've caught about 600 of them out in the ocean since 1937 when we found the first one. But they were extinct at the same time, well, because we don't have them in the column. If they stop in the column and you don't have them above, I think that just means they didn't live at these places. They lived at these places. And the fact you don't find them up here doesn't mean that they're not still around somewhere. That's the topsy fossils, the thing supposed to be at the bottom that you find at the top. Alan Turner refers to that, and especially the implications regarding extinction, in September of this year. Paleontologists really don't know the answer to that. You think some of these quotations are maybe from 5 or 6 years ago, and you're like, well, surely they've learned something since then. Well, this is pretty much up to date, I think, September 6, 2007. We don't know the answer to that. Why some animals survive extinction, others don't, is one of the most difficult questions in paleontology, and why you see this thing that's obviously extinct according to the column, but swimming around, they don't know. It does falsify the idea that because you don't find it above a certain point, it's extinct. And you have literally hundreds of examples of that. But the thing that really is a test in the mind of the evolutionist is the other kind of contradiction. What's supposed to be up found down, or what we'll call the turvy fossils. Because if the mammals had not got there yet and you find them down here at the bottom, then obviously you've got a real challenge. Richard Dawkins describes the implications. We've spoken about him several times this week. We should be very surprised, for example, to find humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to have evolved. If a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in 500 million-year-old rocks, our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. So he's got his chin out pretty far here. You can't find this. And he's rather confident because if you do find it, then he's got answers for that too. For example, we have found that kind of thing rather commonly. One very obvious and dramatic example is near LaSalle, Utah, where perfectly modern human skeletons replaced with malachite are found in a layer that's also found at Dinosaur National Monument, one that is known for its dinosaurs, in the Dakota sandstone. So the key phrase in his statement is, if a well-verified mammal skull were to show up. And when you find it, it's not going to be verified. It must have fallen down a crack. They crawled back in a cave. This is a mine collapse, or any kind of explanation. don't have to have evidence for it. You know dinosaurs didn't live with humans. They were 100 million years apart, most of them. And so if you find them together, something bad happened. Something got messed up. Well, we went back to the site to see if we could, well, verify. And it's a part of an open pit copper mine, just about 20 miles south of Moab. And where you see the backhoe here is where the skeletons were found. Here's one of them still in the rock. This is 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone. And you see in the lower right-hand corner the pelvis, the knee up near the top, the foot over in the lower left. This one is articulated or together as in life. Most of them are just bones piled together, as is the case here. Some of these look like they go together. They really don't. They're just piled together. This is one that had been out of the rock for about 5 minutes when we washed it off there with a canteen and held it up for the picture. It's replaced with malachite, which obviously shows it's not a recent burial. It contains no collagen. That typically takes about 1,000 years to dissipate. And so this is an excellent turvy fossil. I think there's as much verification as you could ever find. We talked to the fellow who actually uncovered it with the bulldozer. And ironically, his father drove the bulldozer at this spot numbers of years ago. This is Dave Fuller. And he's pointing to the spot where this was found, says there were no broken layers, there were no caves, no mine. Looking at a side view, we see the mining operation of the 30s where his father drove the bulldozer, and they hit rocks so hard that they were tearing up the bulldozers. And so it stopped and went out of business and didn't start again until the 70s. And then they went on down to this level where the skeletons were found. Again, a diagram here shows the mining operation of the 30s and then the 70s. Here the road cut was done in 1930, and prior to the road cut, this was completely continuous. The skeletons were found here, again, 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone. There is zero evidence for the intrusional burial of these skeletons. In fact, just overwhelming evidence against it. If they're before 1930, this is the way it looked. And remember then what Dawkins says, if you can well verify it, his conclusion is evolution would be utterly destroyed. I think that's exactly what's happened. But anytime you find bones, they're going to be intrusionally buried. That's just the assumption. But he goes on in this discussion of what would test and falsify evolution, saying, ironically, it's also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. So he's heard about our work down at Glen Rose all the way from Oxford. He refuses to come look, but he's sure that they're fake, but understands that if they were real, this would falsify and utterly destroy. And of course, one of the main reasons that, for the interest is that you can't intrusionally bury footprints, can you? They are where they are. You can't erode them and redeposit, and they don't fall down cracks. And so this is really better evidence than the bones, which he understands. Several of you here have traveled with us down to Dinosaur Valley State Park and seen the footprints there. This is where the Paluxy River runs through the park, and there are just all kinds of dinosaur tracks all over the place down there. They were made famous back in the 40s by Roland T. Byrd, who published a number of articles, and we can see the big sauropod-like elephant tracks almost, and then the three-toed theropods. Here's one of those three-toed tracks, which is rather unusual. It's raised, which caused us to do some head scratching here. How is it? The tracks should be depressed, shouldn't they? Well, yes, but what happened here, the dinosaur stepped, sunk down, left the depressed track. Other material washed over, filled it in, and what filled it in became harder when it became rock, so that when it's later uncovered and erosion now affects it, the center, the infill, is resistant, more resistant to erosion than what's around it, and so it winds up being raised. This is the raised infill. That's significant for some points we'll make again in a moment. But in addition to tracks like this, we also have tracks that look like this. Wonder what that could be. Well, it couldn't be a human track. They were 100 million years apart from the dinosaurs, according to the evolutionists. If they're together, it would utterly destroy, and so this one has to be carved, and this is Dawkins' conclusion. We'll come back to that in a moment. I was somewhat intimidated by the objection because it was just almost too good to be true, and so we looked around for some that weren't quite so good and found some as well. Here's one in the lower right-hand corner that was identified by the Dallas Crime Lab as a human footprint of the same criteria. They identify footprints at a crime scene, along with dinosaur tracks that had just been excavated. And some of the tracks that we found were very, very human-like. But the explanation was either that this is erosion or they were carved. It has to be one or the other. So we got a new set of objections. Instead of falling down a crack or intrusionally buried, now then it's erosion or carved. Well, Stan Taylor decided to test some of these ideas back in the early 70s, taking a bulldozer, a backhoe, and following a trail of two tracks that were seen there in the river that came out of the riverbank. Well, they're alternating layers of clay and limestone and clay and limestone, about 6 feet of them there. And if he removes that and these tracks continue back up under the bank, what would that say about the idea they'd been carved? That'd pretty well rip it, wouldn't it? He did, and yes, found 9 more tracks, for a total of 11, in a right-left pattern, some of them very clear and obvious with the mud push-up around it that you can see here, again arguing against the erosion factor. That doesn't leave a ring around the shape. And so a lot of people got excited about this. It looked like very good evidence. And then Glenn Kuban came up with an explanation, and he got Humanist of the Year for this explanation. He says, are these kind of duck-looking tracks, and there are several of those in the area, erode to look like the one on the right, but the elongate tracks, like you see here at B, erode over a period of time to finally wind up looking like the one down at the lower right-hand corner. And that's kind of human-like, and so these are just eroded dinosaur tracks. And now then we don't have to worry about that anymore. However, when you go back and look at these tracks, here are some of the dinosaur tracks with that infill that was harder. And what happens with erosion here? It gets sharper and clearer because the infill is harder. And when you look at a side view, the three-dimensional aspect of this shows the center being raised, and that's not going to erode to look like a human track, is it? It looks more like a dinosaur track with more erosion. And some of the casts that were made by Stan Taylor were so detailed. Does this look like an eroded dinosaur track? I mean, they're just too much detail for that to be a credible thought. You put a human foot in it, and it fits perfectly. The one that really persuaded me, and I was trying to play the devil's advocate, is there some way that this could be explained, was this track. And you have to, and this, we extended that 11-track series to 14. This was one in the extension. You have to look at this a minute to really see it. As we highlight this area, you can see the dinosaur portion of it. It's about 25 inches long, but look what is in the middle of it, with all 5 toes and instep and heel. But this one is perfect. Several were saying, well, maybe it's erosion. Others were saying maybe it's carved. And when you get both, you know it's right in the middle and is exactly as good as it can get. We made a presentation of this at a national science meeting up in Tennessee. Glenn Kuban was there, who won Humanist of the Year for explaining these away. He was on the plane the next morning and in the river that afternoon with a long iron pole. And we got several calls saying he's out there with an iron pole, and got out there, and by the time we got there, it looked like this. It had just been beaten to pieces. Of course, we had excellent casts and stereo photographs and hundreds of photographic documentations, but he was evidently pretty impressed with the footprint. As you go further up the trail, this is several tracks ahead, you see another. Now, there are 134 dinosaur tracks on this platform and 14 human tracks going through the middle. And sometimes they're beside and across and just outside, sometimes within. Here again within, notice the three-toed dinosaur track up in the anterior forward portion of the track, but in the back portion, it looks like that depressed area is where somebody stepped on it. Again, from a side view of that same track, you see the three toes to the right, almost flush, and perhaps will be raised with further erosion, but the depressed portion fits the human foot just perfectly. When you put your foot in it, it's like a glove. Now, this one is a right. What should we have ahead of it? We should have a left. Here's the next one. And it's right, left for 14. Looking at a side view of this track, you can see that the dinosaur track is beside it. And, of course, the sandbags in the back, it's in the bottom of the river. It's a lot of work to get to do that. It's consistently 11.5 inches. And this is an overview of the entire 14-track trail. Now, when you get 14 in a right-left pattern, consistent in length, you're not looking at erosion. And, of course, it was excavated, most of it, from under the overburden, which eliminates the carving. Now, you can see some strange things in the rocks that look like, wow, that maybe it looks like an Indian head when you go to the cave, and look at the cave. You look up in the clouds and you see, wow, that looks like a bird, and maybe some of these tracks just happen to look like a human foot. This was a sign I saw up in Oklahoma not long ago. You look at that and you say, well, maybe that's a funny looking cloud, but when you see the rest of it, you you think somebody's messing with the clouds here, because you got more than one, and that's not going to happen. You look at the old man in the mountain. That's maybe erosion, right? But how do you know that this is not erosion? Well, if you see 4 old men in the mountain, you got a pretty good idea, don't you? Well, here you've got 14 in a right-left pattern that says, hey, this is not erosion, and it's not carved. This becomes the perfect turvy fossil. We did the measurements and the analysis. All of them look at least like a general human footprint, consistent in length, more so than the dinosaur tracks, some of which are still being revealed. 7 of them have toes. Of course, we've shown you the most dramatic ones. That's very unusual with fossil footprints. Mary Leakey's tracks over in Africa, several spreads in National Geographic, none of them have toe. Well, you can see the great toe in some, but none individual toes. You can distinguish right from left in 12 of the 14. 2 of them are just kind of oblong, and when Glenn Kuban lectures on this subject, guess which 2 he shows you? We did a double-blind test at Kansas State University with the psych department, showing pictures first, what are these? And 97% said they're human footprints. Then we got real rough on the college students. Tell us if they're rights or lefts. And 87% got exactly what we predicted. 12 out of 14, that's just about precisely what we expected. And none of them were consistently different, so that you can say it is consistently rights and lefts where they ought to be. Now, this is the way you do science. Dawkins sits behind his desk at Oxford and says, no way, it's impossible. And we get out and do the work. And I think you can see the difference. This, I think, is the perfect turvy fossil. You can't fall down a crack, intrusionally bury them. They can't be carved. They were excavated from under the overburden. It's not erosion. You got 14 in a right-left pattern. And I just really enjoy presenting this on the college campus and then sitting back and saying, okay, now, what's your explanation? I was at a university up in Tennessee several years ago speaking to a group of about 50 senior geology students, and they turned around after I finished to the head of the department. Okay, what do you have to say? And he said, of course, we don't know that there weren't dinosaurs back there with human feet. And I thought a minute, and I said, well, I guess that's right. Could have been. I also don't know that there weren't humans back there with dinosaur feet. Wouldn't that make about as much sense? I said, wouldn't it be more reasonable to think these things look like dinosaur feet were made by dinosaurs, and these things look like human feet were made by humans? No, he wouldn't agree. And I said, well, if they were made by humans, would they look any different? And he just got up and left. And about half of that, well, a significant portion of that group became creationist. But dinosaurs with human feet is their explanation. Dr. Chuck Finsley, who was curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History for some 30 years, recently retired, came down to Glen Rose and looked at it. He wanted to display some of the dinosaurs we'd excavated, and we made him look at the tracks. And he got a little upset, left, and came back about a month later and got upset and left. Third time down, he said, Dr. Patton, I think I've got an explanation for you. I can tell you what made these human-looking footprints. He says, I think they were made by aliens. Very serious. And I kind of snickered, and he got aggravated. And I said, well, Chuck, if they're made by aliens, I guess they came from a galaxy far, far away. They'd be more advanced than we are. What are they doing to run around barefooted? He left. But this is the best they can do. I think you just ought to take the evidence for what it is instead of desperately trying to explain it away. It kind of reminds me of the Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson. Here's Professor Farrington and his controversial theory that dinosaurs were actually the discarded chicken bones of giant alien picnickers. That sounds pretty far out to me. If you want to draw a cartoon, I think the reality would be more like this: in the throes of a catastrophic flood, as they were trying to escape, they were running, and these were the ones that missed the boat.